he always thought of George as a little brother.
George Harrison quitting the band. What a moment in Peter Jackson's Beatles documentary, Get Back. I sit down with special guest Amanda Wirig, and we discuss why and how this could have happened within the Beatles. But the one thing that stood out for me, that I was glued to the TV as it was happening, and there was no video of it, was I believe after George had left the band, and John and Paul had gone to lunch, and there were no cameras, but there were microphones on the table that picked up on this conversation between Paul and John, who, correct me if I'm wrong, from a band perspective, those were the two leaders of the Beatles, correct?
Right.
That moment in the documentary to where Paul and John are going back and forth to where they didn't think they were being recorded. There's no cameras. And you're listening to the two of them talk very open and frank about the problem that I think John was trying to explain a little bit as to the issue between Paul and George, and the fact that, put your memory in this also, Paul was kind of taking a little bit too much control and telling George what to do. And John was like trying to be a brother and trying to, he's part boss or part leader of this group, but he's also a brother to George and Paul. And they were having this discussion as to what the issue was. And Paul was basically saying, look, I don't want to really be like the leader or tell people what to do, but somebody has to do it. And listening to Paul and John talk about this, I'm getting chills thinking about it, because you're seeing something very open, honest, and true. They had no idea they were being recorded.
When you look back in the history of what had been leading up to that point, when Brian Epstein, their manager, died in 67, like they were just like, 67 is when they did Sgt. Pepper, changing the world. Things are getting really, really big. And then Brian dies. And Brian was like their anchor. He was the manager. He arranged all of that stuff, and he was no longer there. And Paul definitely has his own workaholic tendencies, and it's just why he's still touring at 81. He didn't want this band to fail, and he felt that there needed to be somebody kind of keeping the machine going. So I can totally see his point of view. At the same time, he's also come back and said multiple times that he always thought of George as a little brother, because they were a year apart, and and George was the youngest in the band, and at the time they met, I want to say George was like 15 or something. I mean, like babies. And he always kind of had that mindset of George being the little brother, and I don't think it dawned on him that he was still treating him that way as they were growing older together.
I had heard this grandiose rumors of the animosity starting to build between them. You know, you kind of think when you have four artists like this together in a band, you're all creative and you all can't have your way. And like you were saying with Paul and John were the oldest, and they were the ones that had kind of started the group, right?
Well, actually, John and Ringo were the oldest. Ringo is the oldest, and then Paul, and then George. It was John in his own band, and then Paul saw them playing and kind of like showed off what he could do and was asked to join. And then Paul got George in, and then Ringo came quite a bit later. John and Paul were the primary songwriters. They were really the head of everything.
And that dynamic is hard to break, especially when you got this popular group, and that's just how things had been going. But George, as I'm diving into more of the Beatles stuff, was wanting to start to contribute a little bit more. And then there's a little bit of, they're getting older. You want to be seen as almost equals, that everybody's having an equal say in things. So you are seeing this thing kind of build up within this documentary that people had talked about, and why I think Paul and maybe Ringo and other people that were around this project initially had thought that this was kind of a negative, like they associated negative memories to it, because you could see, and this is kind of attached to what we're talking about, this conversation John and Paul had off camera, but the audio was recorded, where George and Paul get into it, and then George quits the band.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of those moments to where, like, I am like, oh my, what is going on? It's huge, but it was like done in just such a blink of the eye. I think Paul and George, they were working on a song. The four of them were there, and then Paul had suggested that George do it a different way or a certain way, and George is like, I'll do it the way you want, or I won't do it.
Mm-hmm.
Just tell me what you want me to do. And so it was kind of George kind of falling back on, well, fine, I'll just tell me what you want to do. You can see that how that animosity over the years was finally building up and why George quit. So that is a moment along with the John and Paul discussion at the lunch table that stands out for me.